development of new flight control computer operational program software and has developed flight crew training related to this software. On April 12th, the FAA met with safety representatives of the 3 U.S.-based commercial airlines that fly the Boeing 737 MAX, as well as the pilot unions for those airlines. And this unprecedented meeting was an opportunity for the FAA to hear individual views from operators and pilots. The FAA recently solicited public comment on a draft report prepared by the FAA's Boeing 737 MAX Flight Standardization Board. That board consists of pilots, and we use it to evaluate Boeing's proposed training associated with Boeing's proposed software enhancements for the 737 MAX. On May 6th, we initiated a multi-agency technical advisory board, or TAB, to review Boeing's MCAS software update and system safety assessment. The TAB includes experts from the U.S. Air Force, NASA, Volpe, and the FAA. And none of these experts were involved in the original certification of the 737 MAX. The TAB's recommendations will directly inform our decisions on the 737 MAX fleet's return to service. And next week, on May 23rd, the FAA will host a meeting of Directors General of Civil Aviation Authorities from around the world to discuss the FAA's activities toward ensuring the safe return of the 737 MAX to service. This meeting is part of the FAA's efforts to work with other civil aviation authorities to address specific concerns related to the 737 MAX, in keeping with the FAA's long-standing cooperation with our international partners. As our work continues, I want to offer this assurance. In the U.S., the 737 MAX will return to service only when the FAA's analysis of the facts and technical data indicate that it's safe to do so. This concludes my prepared statement. Welcome your questions.
Thank you very much for your statements, both of you. We're now going to move to member questions. Each member will be recognized for 5 minutes, and I'll start by recognizing myself. Administrator Elwell, this week the Wall Street Journal reported that FAA internal review tentatively determined senior agency officials did not participate in or monitor critical safety assessments of the 737 MAX flight control system. Also noted the FAA deferred to Boeing's early safety classification, and the subsequent analysis of potential hazards were performed with limited oversight by the agency. Is that report accurate? And if accurate, what explanation does the FAA have for, I guess, falling down on the job? Microphone.
Thank you for that question, Chairman Larson. I think you're talking about the Wall Street Journal article of yesterday, and we take all those articles and those charges or reports seriously, but frankly, there's nothing in that article that led me to anything that I'm aware of. So we'll certainly see what we can find out about it. But and I'll ask my colleague Earl if he's aware of what the article.
Yeah, before you get to Mr. Lawrence, so the article reported that the FAA's own assessment determined tentatively that senior agency officials were not involved in this assessment.
I'm not aware of an internal assessment.
Mr. Lawrence?
I just reached that conclusion.
I'm not aware of the internal assessment that the article refers to.
Okay, well, we have some homework, and you do too. But I think it does relate to the next set of questions with regards to the ODA and the use of the ODA process. Mr. Elwell, you previously stated, it was reported that you stated, that a full reversion of certification activities to the FAA would require 10,000 additional FAA inspectors and $1.8 billion. I'm not here to argue whether it's one more, one less than that, but has the FAA considered moving back to the previous designated engineering representative system away from the AR system? And what would that cost be?
Chairman Larson, I don't know what that cost would be. I know that there are a number of investigations and audits, as several opening statements have pointed out, that are designed to look at the process. I also know that our risk-based, data-driven systems approach has, as Ranking Member Graves stated, has led to the U.S.'s safest system in history and in the world. I'm very, very careful to make sure that the results of any inquiries, investigations, audits bring us actionable information. I mean, as I said, we welcome those investigations, we welcome the audits, they make us better. But at this point, to say that we're willing to go back to something before we've gone through those investigations, I'm not prepared to say that. I really want to see what these investigations and these audits have to say about our processes.
So the current system with authorized representatives, however, has ODA participants reporting, I understand, to managers as opposed to engineers. And under the DER system, the ODA designees were reporting to engineers. Are you, through your assessment, looking at whether a change from reporting to engineers who can monitor engineers versus to managers who are looking more at budgets? Are you looking at whether that process needs to be changed? Is that going to be part of the Blue Ribbon Commission's look?
Sir, I'm not aware of any limit on what we're going to look at. We're going to look at everything. I would say that the Organization Designation Authority, ODA, as it exists today, is a process that's developed over decades. We've had ODA in one form or another since the beginning of the FAA. We've had delegation of authority since 1927. The concept isn't new, it's the administration of it. In my mind, if we have robust oversight and we have all the protections in place to guard against conflicts of interest or undue pressure, which I believe we currently have, it's a good system. But it can always be made better. I mean, that's what we're all about.
And I'll just conclude on that point, though, that I guess putting the faith in the evolution of the system to get to where we are today isn't necessarily a positive assessment of the system that we have. Just because it has evolved since 1927 doesn't mean it's evolved to the place where it needs to be or should be, and it perhaps has over-evolved in this case, if you will. So with that, I'll yield 5 minutes to Ranking Member Graves of Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Raise your hand if you have a pilot's license in this room. Raise your hand if you have been flying a plane when the stick shaker's gone off. The stick shaker's gone off. So wait, could you do that again? Hands up, stick shaker's gone off. So 3 of you, 4 of you. And did any of you not turn the plane around or come back and land when that happened? Raise your hand if you kept going. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I just want to make note that no one raised their hand in terms of continuing the flight. And the reason I ask that question is that in both accidents, stick shakers went off and the planes didn't turn around. And I find that interesting that that in this case the planes didn't turn around. Mr. Elwell, there's been a lot of confusing information in the news media regarding what happened. And I've read a few times where there has been reference to, quote, self-certification. Could you clarify that? Do companies self-certify their own aircraft?
Mr. Graves, no, sir, they don't. We don't have a program of self-certification. ODA empowers private individuals at a company that has an ODA program to do certain tasks and make certain decisions. They are delegated with that authority that we then oversee. And this isn't something that we give lightly. To be granted an ODA is a privilege that a company earns. We have about 79 or 80 of them, I think. And it's important to note that the vetting that is required of the individuals in an ODA program and the ODA program itself is very thorough and robust. And to your point, Mr. Chairman, we're not resting on that. We don't ever stay static on anything in the FAA safety related. So we'll continue to look at that. And I have to my right Mr. Earl Lawrence, who is our resident expert on ODA and the process, if I can allow him to elaborate.
Thank you. I'd like to build one point onto Mr. Elwell's comments, and it goes back to the Chairman Larson's comment earlier. In an ODA system, we don't have engineers reporting to just managers. We have engineers reporting to engineers. And those engineers all have to be approved and vetted by the FAA. So the head of an ODA is an engineer who has all those skills and experiences that has to be approved by FAA engineers as well.
Thank you. Mr. Elwell, another question. Again, a lot of interesting articles regarding the potential ungrounding of the MAX. Could you describe the steps that the plane would have to go through in order to be ungrounded or to be able to fly again?
Yes, sir. So I think that just to go back a little bit, it's important to lay the groundwork for it. We grounded the U.S. fleet when we had the data to establish a potential causal link between two accidents. That is the justification for a grounding. And it's important that you establish a link because you then have what you need to mitigate, to unground, or to remove the prohibition order. So what we will do is we will receive Boeing's application for a design modification to the MCAS system, and we will thoroughly evaluate that and their system safety analysis. We will evaluate the training required to bring that, to certify that new software system. And once we have made our analysis, we've consulted with the TAB, which, by the way, is a third-party, third set of eyes that I think this committee recommended a month or two ago that should be employed in this instance, and we agree, and we initiated the TAB. And once we are absolutely convinced of the safety of return to service, then we'll do it.
Chairman Sumwalt, very quick, yes or no. Do you believe that there are processes, programs, or procedures that domestic airlines follow that may have prevented these based on your prevented these accidents based on your preliminary reports?
Ranking Member Graves, I apologize. Maybe it's my ears, maybe it's the acoustics in the room. I'm having difficulty hearing the question.
So we'll have to come back to it, but we will. I recognize Chair DeFazio for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Elwell, we were both in the Air Force. You were a pilot. I wasn't. But my understanding is that the Air Force has a minimum of 2 angle of attack sensors on its planes, and sometimes as many as 4. Does that sound right to you?
So there are different numbers depending on the size of the aircraft.
Right,
yes.
but never 1.
As far as I know, never 1.
Right.
The planes I flew in the Air Force had at least 2.
Okay. Then is the MCAS a safety critical system in your opinion?
I didn't make that designation, but it seems to me that yes, it is.
Okay, then why would it trigger with a single point of failure? I mean, isn't that kind of standard that we never have a safety critical system trigger off a single point of failure?
Yes, sir. A single point of failure means that if that component or that part of the aircraft fails, it will lead to an accident.
Well,
in the case
in this case, it led to triggering the MCAS, which is safety critical. Here, let me read you something. I got this from a very, very experienced 737 pilot. If MCAS is not stopped by the pilots at the completion of 2 full MCAS cycles, 10 seconds pause, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, horizontal stabilizer is at or very close to the full nose-down limit of travel. At this point, the pilots do not have enough elevator authority to overcome the horizontal stabilizer, and the nose of the aircraft will continue to fall. The aircraft is no longer controllable in pitch. The only possible recovery is trim the aircraft nose up so the horizontal stabilizer moves to a flyable position. This pilot would characterize an MCAS runaway as having high potential to result in a drastic, abrupt maneuver. That sounds pretty radical. I mean, now, why, in this case, the argument is the pilots are supposed to correct the system, but until after Lion Air, the pilots didn't know the system was installed. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And the pilots also didn't know that the disagree light didn't work unless you bought the optional package of safety, which included another set. You had both the disagree light, and then you had, I guess, digital gauges that showed what the angle of attack sensors were seeing or feeling or doing. So when did the FAA become aware that the disagree light wasn't working, which had been on, I guess, all previous models of the 737?
Sir, if I could go back to the 737 pilot.
Yep.
I wasn't a 737 pilot in my commercial days, but I had the opportunity to fly the Max Sim a month or so ago. And I would offer on the mechanics of it that at the moment that a pilot, and we're trained our entire careers, the moment you feel the airplane doing something you didn't command it to do, you instinctively trim in the other direction. And if it doesn't work, you do a memory procedure called runaway stab trim. Right. So I'm not going to take issue with his comments about 2 bursts of the MCAS, what it might do, but I know as a pilot.
That's an elapsed time period of 20 seconds.
Yeah,
it's 20 seconds.
Yeah,
I mean, that's pretty quick. And if you're at a low altitude, I think it's, pretty. But let's go back to the issue of
disagree.
When the FAA was informed by Boeing. Boeing knew, I believe, about a year before they informed the FAA that the disagree light didn't work. Yeah.
So, sir, we've looked at this, and software engineers discovered the anomaly, and the anomaly was tied to the MCAS software. Part of the change of the
right, but the question, I get that. I mean, we can get into details, but the point is, a year elapsed before Boeing told the FAA. What actions did the FAA take at that point in time? Did you consider that inappropriate behavior by Boeing?
Sir, I'm concerned that it took a year, and we're looking into that, and we're going to fix that. Once we learned that the light was not operable, then we made the decision that it is not a safety-critical display. It's not a safety-critical display. It is advisory. There are no actions that the pilot takes to an Aoa Disagree light. And so it did not.
Well, it would alert them to that whatever the runaway problem is due to, at that point, the angle of attack indicators.
Actually, the notice of that is tactile. One yoke is shaking and the other isn't. That is, by definition, right. Aoa Disagree. So the light is advisory.
Okay, then why is it there at all?
It's good for maintenance. So if you get an Aoa Disagree light in flight, you know to tell maintenance on the ground, hey, check, one of these is not calibrated correctly or is off.
So then really you don't think it's significant that Boeing didn't tell people the system was in the plane and didn't tell people that the disagree light didn't work? None of that was problematic.
I think that's an issue, sir, and we're going to look into it. It shouldn't take a year for us to find out that that discovery was made.
I appreciate that, and I really would want to know the answer. And in fact, the Dallas News, and this is off of a tape recording, so I think it's accurate. This was pilots talking to, after they found out that there was an MCAS system in the plane after Lion Air, talking to a Boeing engineer, and they said, why wouldn't you tell us about the system? I don't know that understanding this system would have changed the outcome. He said, in 1 million miles, you're going to maybe fly this airplane, maybe you're once going to see this ever. We try not to overload the crews with information that's unnecessary. I mean, do we really think that that was unnecessary, that it wasn't even in the manual and they didn't know about it? I mean, there's a lot of stuff in that manual that you don't really need to know.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Chairman, I can't comment on that conversation, and I think you were quoting Boeing. I, as a pilot, when I first heard about this, I thought that there should have been more text in the manual about EMCAS. I agree.
And Mr. Lawrence, in response to the chairman, you said that the engineer reports to an engineer. Can that engineer to which the report is rendered also be a manager at Boeing?
They would be a manager in the organizational delegation organization itself.
Could they have managerial status at Boeing and they're paid by Boeing? Is that correct?
They are paid by Boeing. That is correct.
Okay, thank you. Just one other question. Now, we've had 14, if we could put up on the screen the flight deck 67, flight deck 17. Well, I thought we were going to put it up. But anyway, I have it here. You can't see it, but you'd be familiar with it. We're getting used to our new electronics. But when you think of it, there it is now. Pretty different airplanes. They're computer screens, GPS, everything's digital, the other's analog, very, very different planes. And this is 14 variations later. And I think we've got to question the system where I think if you took the 737-100 and compared it to a MAX, you would say, wow, these are different types. But we sort of gradually got there, kept moving and moving and moving through 14 variations, and never determined that it would have to go through a more rigorous process as a new type, and including pilot retraining and those sorts of things. I mean, doesn't that raise some questions about how you kind of get this creep over 14 variations over however many years that is, 67, 42 years?
Sir, I know that begs the question. I would remind, though, that the amended type certificate of the MAX was amending the NG. And if you had the NG and the MAX side by side, then you could see the similarities. They're so close as to be amended.
It wasn't the NG amended from the 900,
Correct.
Which was amended from the 876 down to 1. So,
Yes,
I mean, that's kind of it's kind of a creep, it seems to me. I think there's a question there that we should look at.
Well, and as I said before, in the beginning of your questions, we welcome that examination. If there's something wrong with the extension of a family, and of course, that's something that the 737 has multiple iterations. But again, we're certifying to the last one.
Okay. All right. With that, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I know we have a 5-minute rule, but I'm indulged the chair. I have 8.5 minutes, and I want to afford that for the ranking member of the committee as well. So recognize Mr. Graves, the ranking member, for up to 8.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could we bring that back up on the screen? Because we keep focusing on the angle of attack indicator. So if you see on the right, the 737 MAX, that screen in front of both the pilot and the co-pilot with the blue above and the brown below, that's your primary angle of attack indicator. That's your artificial horizon. Every aircraft out there has to have that to be certified. The one on the left, the older version, that's digital on the right. The one on the left is what we call analog. And if you see the circle in front of both the pilot and the co-pilot, and there's white above and black below, it's the same thing. That's your artificial horizon. That's your primary angle of attack indicator. In fact, all my years of flying, I don't think I've ever had an actual, what we're talking about, angle of attack indicator in any of the aircraft I've ever flown. But what's interesting too is, and we fail to, and I go back to this, you got to know how to fly the plane, In Ethiopia Airlines incident, you can look outside. That's the critical angle of attack indication right there. Look outside the airplane when you're flying it. You can tell if you're at a critical angle of attack because you're going to be pitched up. You're getting close to a stall situation. Those are your two main angle of attack indicators. First of all, look outside when you're flying the plane, and second of all, look at your artificial horizon. And I guess my first question is for Administrator Elwell, and at this point we know, and we always know, there's so many other things to look at in these investigations. You know, not just FAA certification activities with the 737 MAX, but many, many other things. And what I want to get to is the preliminary report shows that there were a lot of misidentifications on what was occurring in the aircraft and misapplications of safety procedures and training in itself. And as a pilot, I want you to talk to us as a pilot. Can you provide us some context as to what actions or inactions by the pilots or the airline, for that matter, also require some close examination in the course of this investigation?
Yes, sir. Thank you for that question. As a pilot, I mentioned a little bit earlier that in the U.S., training focuses on hand flying, manual flying. There are other parts of the world and other countries that focus on flight control management. But in the U.S., from the first training you do as a pilot, Air Force for me, but it's the same in civil, it's flying the aircraft. And what was going on, it's already been pointed out that there was a false indication of a stall, immediately recognizable to the trained pilot as a false indication because one yoke was shaking, the other wasn't. What concerns me about the data from the flight data recorder is the apparent lack of recognition of runaway stab trim. Runaway stab trim is taught at the earliest stages of aircraft that have stab trim motors. And it is so important, to Chairman DeFazio's point about elapsed time, it's so important that you don't pull out a checklist, you don't open and look at what next. It's memorized, and you're tested on it all the time, and you turn off those stab trim motors. In the Lion Air accident, it's significant that even though the airplane was pitching against the pilot's commands, that's classic runaway stab trim, the stab trim motors in 13 minutes were never turned off. And I think you made the point, sir, in your remarks that in the case of the Ethiopian Air flight, they did turn them off, although they didn't adhere to the emergency AD that we put out on November 8th. They did turn the stab trims off, but they never controlled their airspeed, and then subsequently, about a minute before the end of the flight, they turned them back on. Both of those things are unfortunate, obviously, and I have to point out, in deference to a colleague here to my left, Chairman Sumwalt, these investigations are ongoing. And as you said, there are so many pieces to any accident. I've never looked at an accident where there weren't 3 or 4 or 5 links of the chain, any one of which, if it hadn't gone wrong, the plane would have survived. So we know that there's going to be, and there are, factors. But as a pilot, as you asked me, that's what I saw. The lack of control on the speed on Ethiopian, and the inability, the apparent not doing the stab trim cutout switch procedure.
We come back to, and we keep coming back to it and forgetting that, you know, once they set those throttles to full power, they never retarded them. And I've used that analogy, before. When you're in a car and you're speeding towards a brick wall, full speed, you're going to take your foot off the gas. That's what most people would do. But they accelerated right through their certified maximum speed of the Max8 and just kept on accelerating throughout the entire process. That aircraft kept accelerating. And when you get those kind of pressures against the control surfaces, it makes it very, very hard to do manually. And, you know, and again, this comes back to so many times. Pilot training, this is what worries me more than anything else. And I hate to disparage, you know, another country and what their pilot training is, but that's what scares me in all of this, is climbing on an aircraft or an airline, you know, that is that is outside U.S. Jurisdiction. I know what we have in the U.S., and I know what we are capable of, and I know the quality of our pilots and the quality, what they have to go through to get to that point. And I just think it just bothers me. Here we are, we continue to tear down our system based on, what has happened in another country, 2 other countries, and particularly given the qualifications and, and what we're learning about the training standards. But that last part was more editorial than anything else, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Graves. I now recognize Representative Norton for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, we don't want to tear down our system. We want to restore confidence in our system, Mr. Ewell. And I'm sure you are concerned that this impressive record may well be shattered. I regard it as a purpose of this hearing, as your answers to help us, if we can, restore confidence in a system that, by the way, most members, maybe except me, use every single week to go back and forth to the Congress. So this loss of confidence, despite this wonderful 10-year record, seems to have been shattered. And so just let me ask you a question preliminarily, Mr. Elwell. I think most members of the public, after one crash, would have said, oh, that's unusual. Well, just 2 crashes. Why did it take so long compared to other countries that made the decision almost immediately after the Ethiopian Airlines accident? In fact, as I recall it, the president made the announcement, but as is his wont, he probably was perhaps preempting the FAA, but that's where the announcement came from. If anything, it signaled the importance that somebody should speak up. So I think the public, which will be interested in this hearing, wants to know, why did it take you so long after the Ethiopian Airlines accident? Explain that to this committee.
Ms. Norton, thank you for that question. The FAA is a data-driven, risk-based systems approach to all things safety. When we take an action, and whether it's the grounding of an aircraft or an airworthiness directive or...
Other countries weren't data-driven? That's the difference between you and other countries?
I can't speak to the decision-making of other countries. I can tell you this, a number of countries that grounded their 737 MAX fleets called us immediately after and asked what data we had. Several countries asked after grounding their fleets, what are we going to need?
That means that they were looking at real-time, real-life evidence, even if it may have contradicted the data. Are you still as reliant on data as you were then compared to other countries? Today, would you be reliant only on data?
Well, ma'am, that's a great question. We made our decision to ground the aircraft when we had the data that linked the 2 flights, data to link the flights. But we weren't just sitting waiting for the cockpit voice recorder or the flight data recorder. We were examining, as the regulator of our 737 MAX fleet, what's going on with our fleet. And we drew data on 57,000 flights, and we were talking constantly with our neighbor to the north.
That was after the first?
From the first accident, but up through Ethiopia, to find out, are we, the fleet that I am responsible for regulating, are they experiencing any anomalies? And there were zero in 57,000 flights.
Could I ask you this, Mr. Elwell?
I'm sorry, ma'am.
Could I ask you this then? Okay. Again, we see reliance, and I would say perhaps over-reliance on data. Did the president make this call, or did the FAA make this call?
FAA's the safety regulator. FAA made the call to ground
And he
the
only
aircraft.
made the announcement. Is that what you're saying? You were prepared to make that call yourself after the second accident?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, he preempted you, but you were prepared to do it. You wouldn't have waited for a third accident. The data told you after the second accident.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Could I ask you, Mr. Elwell, does the FAA mandate pilot training on all of its systems in which, and this was news to me, in which the pilot is considered the redundancy for the system's failure? Most of us didn't know that the pilot was so considered.
Mr. Elwell, you have to take that question for the record.
I'm sorry, sir.
You'll have to take the question for the record
Okay.
and recognize Mr. Mitchell, Representative Mitchell, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The effectiveness, the success of the aviation system in North America has been based on safety, reliability, and transparency of decision-making, both in terms of certification of aircraft, pilot qualifications, and when there are incidents. Mr. Elwell, you recall last week there was a briefing for members of the committee on the 737 MAX certification. I asked a question. I asked what the FAA had done in the process of reviewing and certifying the MCAS system. To be honest with you, sir, I got a whole description of what the system did and didn't do, but I didn't get an answer to my question. At no point did I. And then we're greeted by, as Mr. Fazio notes, this Wall Street Journal article. So I'll ask the question again. I'll ask it for the record, and I will ask you to submit in writing to the committee what were the steps the FAA took in reviewing the MCAS system and the accompanying training. Because I've asked it now 3 times, and I'd be blunt with you, sir, with all due respect, I haven't gotten a direct answer, and the committee deserves it.
We will get that answer for you, sir.
That would be deeply appreciated, and I'd like it straight up. What was the engagement in the system throughout the process in detail? Don't worry about boring me. I don't believe the chair is going to be bored by reading this. I certainly am not. We need to understand that because there's a critical component of this.
Yeah, and I can assure you that the MCAS system was examined and certified because it was a new system to the MAX.
It was.
And we retained it, and we had the oversight of that, and we certified it.
Well, as you may recall, I asked the question and didn't get an answer that was anywhere close to satisfactory. I'd appreciate it. Let's transition to, as is noted, the 737 MAX has flown 57,000 flights in North America without an incident. Part of the difference is the training of the aviators, the pilots. I mean, I've done some instruction. I don't have a pilot's license. I don't have enough time. But what's clearly made to me is first thing you aviate, you fly the plane. Then you navigate, then you communicate. So, yeah, I've seen a stick shaker. They made me do it. It's interesting. I'm concerned that, and I'm trying to be respectful because they're deceased. The pilot in command of the Ethiopian Air was 29 years old and was reported to have 8,100 and change hours of flight. Now, let me give you some examples. Close friends of mine are commercial pilots, flew for major corporations. He's 58, has 17,000 hours. The other gentleman is 63, also flew for major corporations in private flight. Is 63 years old, has 20,000 hours. The first officer had 361 hours. Do we not have concerns with not only the training of pilots in other nations, but the reliability of their logs to try and claim 8,100 hours at age 29? How many pilots do you know have over 8,000 hours at 29 years of age?
Mr. Mitchell, I don't know anybody 29 years old that has 8,100 hours, but I'm not going to say that that's not possible. And the answer to your question is, do we want to examine and take a very hard look at the training standards globally? Yes, absolutely. We've been involved. The U.S. has led on pilot training for many years, and we do that at the International Civil Aviation Organization, the UN body that provides the guidance for standards around the world.
I think it needs to be an issue that we address with ICAO and as we deal with this, because clearly with the disparities concerning to me. One quick question, I guess I would also ask you to submit this for the record because time is going to run short. In reference to my colleague's question, part of the reason for the delay or the delayed response to the United States is we got our data from Canada, did we not?
Indirectly, yes, sir.
We didn't have the data, the same level of specificity that Canada had because we don't have access to that system that they use for their traffic control, correct?
We do have access to it, sir, but Canada got it first because it came from a company that the air traffic services in Canada is
Can you
partial
submit
owner.
that whole process, that whole timeline in writing to the committee, please?
Yes, sir. Will
Thank
do.
you, sir. One last comment. I believe that we've got the most advanced aviation system in the world. We'll find multiple factors that contribute to this terrible tragedy, one of which will be we didn't see things that could have come up. It's hard to sometimes have a crystal ball. But when you do recertify this aircraft, I will be among the first to buy a ticket to fly in the plane because I have faith in our aviation system, I have faith in the FAA, and I have faith in Boeing and the aircraft they fly. I'll buy one, I'll fly it somewhere to make the point that we have to trust our aviation system. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you. I now recognize Representative Lipinski for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sitting here in front of the family of a victim of one of the crashes of a 737 MAX and looking at the pictures of the victims, it's crystal clear that what the responsibility of the FAA, the NTSB, and our committee is right now. We need to get to the bottom of what happened so we can do whatever we can to ensure the safety of air passengers. And from what we know so far, it seems to me at least, although there sounds like there have been other factors, but it seems that something went wrong with the FAA's safety certification of the 737 MAX, and 346 people died. We need to figure out what went wrong. If it was the certification process itself, we need to fix it to avoid a repeat. If it was the problem with the lack of compliance with the process, then we have to hold accountable whoever it was that was not compliant, the FAA and or Boeing. In addition, further steps must be taken to ensure compliance. Now, this is not a legal proceeding here, and I know that we're in the early stages of the investigation of the crashes and the certification of the MAX. But stories we've heard about the process of certification so far are troubling. The guiding principle of the FAA and manufacturers must be safety, not getting a highly valued plane out more quickly. A question was raised earlier by Chairman DeFazio about why the 737 MAX was not required to get its own type certificate. To me, this is very troubling. It seems to me that because it didn't have to get its own type certificate, it could move more quickly through the process. Now, I'm not a pilot, and I'll defer to the pilots on this committee when it comes to issues of their experience as pilots, but I am a mechanical engineer. I know that this plane, Boeing needed to compete with Airbus. In order to have a more fuel-efficient planes, they put new engines on the plane. The engines had to be put further forward on the wings. These changes in aerodynamics caused the need for the MCAS system. And it seems to me that the MCAS system fundamentally changes the way the Boeing 737 flies. How is this not a major change that required a new type certificate?
Well, thank you for that question, Mr. Lipinski, and I'm glad you asked it because, and I appreciate that you're an engineer. Actually, the MCAS was put into the 737 MAX for the opposite reason. It doesn't make it fly differently. The MCAS was designed into the airplane to make it fly and feel for the pilots exactly like the NG.
Yes, but it was a change. It was a fundamental change to how it flies. I understand it was put in there to try to make it fly the same way, but the system itself was a change.
So the MCAS was added to a system that is on the NG called the speed trim system. It is, and I'm not an engineer, but it is a layer below, a software layer below the speed trim system. And as you said, the MCAS was put in because the engines brought the CG a little bit forward on the airplane. The test flights demonstrated that in a high angle of attack regime, the yoke didn't feel the same to the pilots as the NG. The MCAS pushed the nose over so that controllability and the feel in the yoke would be the same. And the flight test pilots deemed that it was identical, and then the Flight Standardization Board pilots, which were actually line pilots that we enlisted to fly both planes, came to the same conclusion.
Well, I'm hopeful that this was not a situation where the desire was just to get the plane out more quickly, that it wasn't a situation where safety was not the priority, because that must be the priority. As I said, for the FAA, for the manufacturer, safety must be the priority. I understand how important Boeing is as an American company, but safety must always come first.
Sir, I
yield back.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you, sir.
Representative Spano for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before I begin, I too want to extend my sincere condolences and regrets to the members of the family who are here today. Can't imagine what you're going through, and thank you for being here. Very grateful that you're here. My first question is to Mr. Elwell. Can you help me understand, describe in a little bit more detail the FAA's delegation authority? What are the things we delegate? What are the things that we don't delegate? Those things that we do delegate, how does the FAA oversee the actions of designees? Just generally, thank you.
Thank you, sir, for that question. The key word in your question, detail, begs that after I introduce it, I'd like to hand off the detail of the ODA to Earl, who is our resident expert. I will just start by saying the Organizational Designation Authority, as it's come to be known, ODA, is a long-standing principle and certification, and it is a way in which the FAA leverages the expertise within the manufacturing entity. It's very important we understand that without leveraging their engineering expertise, it would be virtually impossible to have the system that we have today. So as far as the details of how the ODA is administered, Earl?
I appreciate that, and I appreciate it's a long-standing process, but I think the public would like to know,
Yes, sir.
so that they can have some level of confidence that the FAA is doing the job we expect them to do. What is delegated, what is not, how do we oversee that?
Thank you, sir.
So thank you for the question, because I think there is a lot of misunderstanding of our delegation process. I'd like to simplify our CERT process in 4 key areas, and the first and foremost is setting the standards. What are the rules and requirements for any design to meet? Next are another layer of test protocols and standards, so it's how you're going to show compliance. The third level is the actual doing of the tests and the calculations. And then the fourth is the overview of all those results and the approval. Only in that third level, the actual doing of a test is where delegation is used. FAA is fully responsible for setting the standards that all tests must comply with and setting the standards for the minimum safety for that aircraft and then reviewing it all in the end. We never give up that authority. We take advantage of the expertise of the people who are actually building and designing the aircraft to assist us in reviewing those tests and those procedures, particularly on things that have been done over and over and over again over many years. I want to highlight that it took us 5 years and over 110,000 man-hours to certify the 737 MAX. I don't think that was a quick process or just cursory review. We apply the same rigorous standards on whether it's a derivative design or original design, and I'm proud of my team for their abilities and their expertise in reviewing any certification project.
Thank you, Mr. Lawrence. Next question is for Chairman Sunwall. If you would just help me understand, over the last maybe 2 or 3 decades, what's the state of commercial airline safety here in the United States? Give us, if you would, a brief sketch in 1 minute and 12 seconds.
Well, I think generally speaking, the state of the airline industry in the United States over the last few decades has increasingly gotten safer and safer. But as it was pointed out earlier, we had one fatality in the past decade. One is too many. And of course, we have the families of the Colgan 3407 crash here. There was 50 lives lost there. So it's good, but good is not good enough.
And then one final question. It's been mentioned that we can't control necessarily some of the pilot training protocols abroad. Are there any mechanisms, if any, that we have at our disposal to ensure that other countries, do require their pilots to have the training that we feel is appropriate? And if so, what are those mechanisms?
Yes, ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization, outlines the standards and recommended practices for member states to follow. There are 193 states that are subscribers to, or signatories to ICAO.
And you can get us further information on that as well. We're also remind the subcommittee that we've asked through a bipartisan letter to the DOT-IG for the international pilot training standards and some other information as well. We get that, we'll share it with the full committee. Recognize Representative Cohen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Express my sadness at the loss of the individuals and for the parents to be present here and all the relatives. Mr. Elwell, I believe it was every country grounded the MAX before we did. Every country. Is it because they were too quick to draw a conclusion from 2 airplanes going down in similar circumstances and realizing the flying public should be protected in their countries? Or was it because we were just so much better at using data and not being concerned with the fact that there were 2 identical or close to identical crashes? How were we last?
Mr. Cohen, as I mentioned earlier, the FAA is data-driven, risk-based systems approach. We don't deviate from that because it's critically important that that's how we operate. You mentioned we were the last. As far as we know, and we have talked to these countries who grounded their fleets, we were the first country to ground because of a data that linked the 2 accidents, which is critically important. Us and Canada, I must say, Canada also waited till we had that data. And the data was not available until the radar tracks were refined to suggest, and in evidence we found on the ground, that linked the 2 flights.
So the opposite of data is common sense? The other countries acted on what looked like with common sense, that there's a causal connection and a reason to think 2 airplanes fall out of the sky and they crash with similar problems with keeping the plane under control after takeoff and high speeds. And that's because you don't have the data yet, you're jeopardizing another airplane. It just seems like common sense should have taken control. Data's fine, but sometimes it's just right before your eyes. There was a story or article written that pilots of planes that didn't crash in the United States kept noticing the same basic pattern of behavior that is suspected to have been behind these 2 crashes. This was in the Dallas Morning News review of voluntary aircraft incident reports to the NASA database. Pilots all safely disabled the MCAS and kept their planes in the air. But one of the pilots reported to the database that it was, quote, unconscionable that a manufacturer, the FAA, and the airlines would have pilots flying an airplane without adequately training or even providing available resources and sufficient documentation to understand the highly complex systems that differentiate this aircraft from prior models. Mr. Elwell, how can it be that we didn't tell the pilots about MCAS and implore them to be aware of it and the situation? This was the system that was put in to allow there to be what was arguably a new airplane to compete with Airbus and we didn't tell the pilots?
So, Mr. Cohen, the reports that you're referring to, they're called ASRS. It's a indemnified safety reporting system. There were, in the 50,000 flights in the MAX, we had 24 reports that mentioned, from pilots, that mentioned some sort of anomaly on pitch. None of those reports were related to the MCAS, zero. And so, and as I mentioned, we scanned and filtered every one of those flights for evidence that there was MCAS or AOA vane anomalies in the U.S. fleet. That is what FAA needs to do. It's what we did. There were no reports of MCAS anomalies reported on the MAX.
Has the FAA considered requiring that pilots that fly the MAX get simulator training?
I'm sorry, do you mean?
In the future, that anybody that flies a 737 MAX, that there be a simulator and that they be trained in that simulator?
Well, so we need to wait for the Boeing application of the fix. Once we have the official application of the fix, we'll be able to determine if and exactly what sort of training will be required for MAX pilots.
And one last question. Media reports indicated that Boeing underestimated the capability of MCAS by a magnitude of 4 times in its initial submission to the FAA, and the FAA only found out about it from Boeing's notice to airlines explaining MCAS after the Lion Air accident. For the record, can you please confirm this account, and if that's not correct, please clarify the timeline.
I'll get an answer for you on that question, sir. I'm not familiar with.
Okay, we'll put it in our written question.
Take it for the record.
I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair recognizes Representative Balderson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I also would like to express my condolences to the families that are here, and my thoughts and prayers are with you. Administrator Elwell, thank you for being here today in this important hearing. There are currently 79 aircraft certification service, ODAs. Are you aware of any international civil aviation organization standards or recommended practices that directly conflict with the FAA use of the organization delegation authorization program?
Sir, I'm not aware of any. I will tell you that ODA is a practice shared by all countries who do certification. And in some countries, they use it much more than we do. But please, if you let me defer to my colleague Earl on the specificity of your question.
So delegation is used universally throughout the certification process and in all countries. And I guess I would highlight that the 737 MAX was a dual certification in this case with EASA, the European Safety Organization, and the FAA. And so all the decisions and review of the delegation and those activities was conducted by both agencies at the same time. So I think that shows the reinforcement and the comfortableness of another authority and how we use delegation to assist us.
Thank you very much. Administrator Elwell, you state that any party the FAA regulates remains responsible for compliance with the FAA's regulatory standards, and the FAA does not hesitate to take enforcement action when it is warranted. Can you provide examples of when FAA enforcement action has taken as a result of noncompliance and how the FAA was able to discover violations of your regulatory standards?
Sir, there are examples when we have had to take enforcement action. In particular, there have been several actions taken with ODA. I think, and Earl will correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that we have denied ODA authority a certificate for ODA on at least one occasion. And then within the ODA organizations, our oversight will occasionally discover somebody not following. You have to understand that the organization itself is run by a manual that is written specifically for the activities that the ODA is allowed to do. And when that manual is not followed, then the oversight catches it will step in. But Earl, is there amplification on that?
Just to build a little bit on Mr. Elwell's comments there, we have removed one ODA, but there are multiple findings, as we say it. We audit every single one of these entities on an annual basis, and per the direction of this committee in our reauthorization bill, you've asked us to stand up a new ODA oversight office, and Mr. Elwell signed off on setting that office up in April. And that will change us to not just waiting for an annual basis. That will transition us to a constant overview of data flow. So we'll be constantly monitoring and not just relying on annual audits. So it will reinforce that to an even greater extent, our oversight.
All right, thank you both very much. I yield back my remaining time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Balderson. We go with Chair recognizes Representative Titus for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I represent Las Vegas, and about half of the 42 million people come by plane, and so having high safety standards is very important. When this first happened, though, I fly back and forth on Southwest every weekend. First thing I did was call to see if the flight I had scheduled was one of these that was in question. Then I realized if I'm scared to fly on that, I don't want my family, my friends, my constituents, or my visitors to fly on that plane too. So it's very important that we get to the bottom of this. So I thank the chairman for having this hearing. We've heard a lot of defense from you this morning about ODAs and the emphasis on data being the reason you grounded the plane. And that all sounds fine, but the public perception was that it took so long for us to do it, we were the last ones to do it, is because the FAA was just too cozy with Boeing, that you were in bed with those that you were supposed to be regulating, and that's why it took so long. So that's the impression the public has and what we need to deal with. Now the emphasis shifts from not the grounding, but the ungrounding. So I would ask you what process you're going to use to unground this plane. I know you've created some new organizations within the agency. I think on the 2nd, Mr. Elwell, you announced the formation of the Joint Authorities Technical Review Team that includes a number of representatives from other countries, including Ethiopia and Indonesia, to investigate your certification process. Last week, you announced a multi-agency technical advisory board to review the proposed software fix. These don't have regulatory authority, but I wonder, are you going to use their decisions before you move to ungrounding? Are you going to have their consensus? What's it going to look like to the public if you ignore them and they just become window dressing? Would you address now the next step?
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for that question because it's very important. We have established the safety record that we have by doing just what you alluded to, listening, getting feedback, getting suggestions. We've been incredibly transparent throughout the process, and that's what we are with all of the countries we deal with the stakeholders in the aviation industry. The tab that you mentioned and described perfectly, and the JATR, the tab, by the way, as I mentioned earlier, Chairman DeFazio recommended that over a month ago, and we agreed wholeheartedly. And we will listen. And in fact, they're reviewing right now. We've already received, I believe, a couple of suggestions. We're also on, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we're going on May 23rd to meet with. We invited 57 countries that grounded the MAX. And invited their civil aviation authority directors to come and talk to us, and us to them, more importantly, explaining to them exactly the process, our safety analysis. We will not allow the 737 MAX to fly in the U.S. until it is absolutely safe to do so, and we will use every tool, every data gathering capability we have to ensure that's the case. You have that as a personal commitment and as a commitment of 45,000 passionate aviation professionals in the FAA.
And what role will Boeing play in this process?
So Boeing will submit their application for the update to the MCAS software. The formal and final submission we expect, I don't know, Earl, the next week or so, or And at that point, we'll do test flights, we'll do analysis, we'll present it to the tab will look it over. We will do a thorough and robust safety analysis. We will determine, based on the software fix they give us, we'll determine what level of training will be required of 737 MAX pilots. And then once we have established all of that, and internally the FAA review says that the 737 MAX is safe to fly, then the prohibition order will be lifted, and we will present whatever mandates are tied to this new software.
And do you believe you have the resources and the expertise without depending on the ODAs to provide that final oversight and make that guarantee that it's safe to fly again?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
And how do you reassure us of that? And the public?
I point to an organization, the FAA's diligence in safety, that has produced a record that is in many ways remarkable in the U.S. I also point, as I just said, the FAA, I've never seen, outside of Chairman Zumwalt's organization, a more dedicated organization of safety professionals. I'm awed every day I come to work. They are amazing, and I'll tell you, they are. I'm a little bit worried about morale right now, to be honest with you, across the FAA. It is critically important to me that we, and of course to the world and to the U.S., that we get this right. But it's important for public confidence, like as you said. And it's important for the morale of the great professionals that are doing the work to get this airplane safely back in the air. And we're not going to do it till it's safe.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Titus, I recognize Representative Massey for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to widen our focus here a little bit and talk about the types of data we collect, flight data, how we collect it, and what we do with it after it's collected. Not just in these particular incidents, but other incidents, because I find it odd that 2 weeks, 30 days after the incident, there's still speculation and guessing about what the pilots did, how did they react, and we don't know. Probably just about everybody in this room has a camera in their pocket. And earlier in this hearing, we saw a picture of a 1967 flight deck of a 737 versus a 2017 flight deck of a 737 MAX. And I understand why in 1967 there weren't cameras in the cockpit. Can you speak to why we don't have cameras in the cockpit, cameras that are cheap and would answer so many of these questions we're still speculating about, it seems? Mr. Zumwalt, please.
Thank you very much for that question. The NTSB has, in fact, recommended that
I'm talking about for commercial flights, of course.
That's right. Cockpit image recorders should be required for commercial flights. We have, for airline flights, we have made that recommendation, and it has not been acted upon.
Why hasn't it been acted upon?
Well, that's a great question, and it's a question that the regulator should answer.
Can I ask you, Mr. Elwell? Do you have a thought on that?
So the FAA works with our colleagues at the NTSB very closely. And we take every recommendation the NTSB makes and we examine it and we evaluate it for safety of flight. And that is our first and foremost consideration. And Chairman Zumwalt and I have not always disagreed on all the recommendations, but I think we would both say that the semi-symbiotic relationship that we have has been part and parcel of where we are today and the safety record we have today.
Let me ask about the way we collect the data. Can you explain to my constituents why for $10 they can get internet on a flight for the whole flight, yet we're still chasing down a physical black box to find out what happened in the cockpit? Why do we have to go to the crash site to recover the data in this day and age? And why is all the data lost if we can't find the black box? Mr. Zumwalt or Ms. Schultz, if you'd like to answer.
Sure, thank you for that question.
I'm not advocating getting rid of the black box. I'm saying, why can't we augment it with some streaming?
Sure, and I think the industry has been looking at this from a technical standpoint to understand what is technically feasible, but I think that is something that would be an important backup to the equipment on the aircraft, which is still a valuable tool, and in these accidents, extremely valuable for us to understand what was going on on the aircraft and in the cockpit.
It's hard for me to explain to my constituents who get on the plane and get internet why it's not technically feasible. Now, I know why it wouldn't work in every situation, and why you need the black box. But let me go to my third question, which is what do we do with the data after we retrieve it? Mr. Sumwalt, why doesn't the NTSB publish all data from the black box immediately upon retrieval?
Well, thank you very much. We do eventually publish that, and let me point out that the NTSB uses a party system. So when we have the data, the manufacturer has it, it's shared with the manufacturer, with the FAA, with anybody who needs it to be able to understand the circumstances of that crash so that they can make immediate safety fixes.
I appreciate your answer, but I said immediately, and you said eventually.
Okay, if we're talking about public release of the information, yes, that does become available when we open the public docket.
Why not make it immediate? What benefit is conveyed upon society by withholding that data from the manufacturer, the person who actually made the equipment? Why aren't they allowed to have it immediately, and why is the NTSB allowed to withhold or block them from getting that data when, and I'm talking about the difference between immediately and eventually, because lives could be lost eventually.
All right, let me make an important clarification. The manufacturer and the FAA has access to that information immediately when we have it. They are part of our party process. They are in the room reviewing the data immediately with us.
I'm glad to have your assurance on that. I have some manufacturers that have experienced different results. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Recognize Representative Stanton for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We're here today because of the unspeakable loss of 346 lives in the tragic crash of Lion Air's Flight 610, Ethiopian Flight 302. Our aviation system is the safest in the world, but these accidents have shaken the public's confidence and trust. We owe it to the people whose lives were lost and their families to get to the bottom of what happened and address any issues within the FAA's certification process to ensure the safety of not only this aircraft, but the system as a whole. The MAX should not be returned to service until the safety of the aircraft is assured by FAA, Boeing, and its operators. Back-to-back crashes demand the reviews of Boeing and FAA's responses that are underway. We need to get to the bottom of why a single point of failure was permitted in the MAX. Commercial aviation, especially in the United States, is so safe in large part because of safety redundancies. Based on preliminary reports, a single point of failure appears to have played a significant role in these tragedies. Now, there have been reports of certain optional safety features of the MAX were sold as extras. And my question is for Mr. Elwell. Is it common to have safety features offered as optional and not mandatory?
Mr. Stanton, any safety critical component to the certification of an aircraft is not optional. It's part of the certification of the aircraft.
Would those features, which were not on either of the Lion Air or Ethiopian planes, have made a difference in aiding the pilots to more quickly identify the MCAS system was triggering?
In my opinion, no. I think you're referring to the Aoa Disagree light?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Should these be required features?
I actually would like to defer to Mr. Lawrence.
Please.
So Aoa Disagree Indicator was not on the original 737. It was first introduced on the NG model. It is a maintenance alert, so we do not consider it part of our critical items. And I'm not aware of which aircraft other aircraft may or may not have it installed.
As far as you know, what are Boeing's plans to incorporate these features on all Boeing aircraft?
Are they looking to incorporate the AOA indicator on all Boeing aircraft?
Yes.
It is not, my understanding is it is not on other Boeing aircraft. It was just the NG, in the manner that it was displayed.
I understand that the software modifications for the MCAS system are in process. Can you describe the status of the modifications you would expect for the MAX? And then how confident are you that these will reduce another incident involving a runway stabilizer trim event?
So
Please.
I'll let Earl modify or get into more detail on my
Please.
answer, but we are expecting the formal application of the MCAS update, software update, soon. We do know the basic parameters of there's three pieces to that fix that would, in once established and once put on airplanes, would render the scenarios that were perpetuated in the Lion Air and the Ethiopian accidents, they wouldn't happen the way they happened there. But I'll let Earl elaborate any further
Mr.
on
Lawrence?
that.
Yes, thank you. The software, I would call it the beta version for this audience here, has been submitted to us. And the reason why they submit it to us is so we can stick it in the simulator, so we can test it, so we can also look at their system safety analysis and see whether it will appropriately address it. The key thing the new software does is look at both angle of attack indicators to assure that a single failure will not cause the system to initiate and future changes.
All right, one more question for Mr. Elwell. You're a U.S. Air Force Academy graduate, combat pilot during Operation Desert Storm, commercial pilot for 16 years with a combined 6,000 flight hours. It's a very impressive experience. Do you think the FAA should have mandated training for the MCAS system for pilots knowing what we know now?
Well, sir, thank you for that question. The investigations and the audits and the reviews currently underway are going to make their recommendations. I'm going to answer you the way you asked the question as a pilot, as somebody who has devoted my entire life to flying and safety. At the beginning, when I first heard of this, thought that the MCAS should have been more adequately explained in the ops manual and the flight manual. Absolutely. In our emergency airworthiness directive that we issued on November 8th after Lion Air, we added explanation of MCAS, and we also reminded our own operators and the world via a document we call a CANIC. We reminded pilots that when to engage runaway pitch trim procedures. And we added a note to those instructions. When we complete our overview and we complete our safety analysis, I expect that we will have amplified MCAS description in addition to anything else that we think and we find is needed to make pilots more aware and respond better to an anomaly.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We're going to proceed on our side of the aisle with questions, and then if there's a member of the Republican Party that shows up that hasn't asked questions, then they'll get in line at an appropriate time. So we'll go with, next is Representative Craig, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, want to express my sincere condolences to the members. The family members are here today for the lives that were lost. Mr. Elwell, as you may know, before I came to Congress, I worked in a similarly highly regulated space, the medical device industry, where one malfunctioning defibrillator or pacemaker could result in an innocent life lost. We heeded strict compliance and reporting requirements to disclose aftermarket malfunctions to the government through the FDA's adverse event reporting system. This aftermarket reporting was and continues to be justified. With that in mind, I'd like to learn more about the manufacturer aftermarket reporting requirements that allow the FAA to be notified about certain failures, malfunctions, or defects. Because according to media reports, Boeing first discovered that the angle of attack sensor disagree light software was malfunctioning a few months after delivery of the MAX in May of 2017. At that time, they learned the disagree light wouldn't work unless airlines also had the optional Aoa indicators. Therefore, 80% of pilots flying Boeing's MAX believed an indicator light would show when in fact it would not. But it wasn't until Lion Air in October of 2018, over a year later, that Boeing finally notified FAA that most planes were flying with software malfunctions. Furthermore, the New York Times reported yesterday that pilots from American Airlines pressed Boeing executives to work urgently on a fix. In a closed-door meeting, they even argued that Boeing should push authorities to take an emergency measure that would likely result in the grounding of the MAX. So with that, I have 3 yes or no questions, and then I have a 4th. Did Boeing have an obligation to report this aftermarket software malfunction to the FAA?
Boeing software engineers did write a PR, what is the performance report? Problem report.
Okay.
They followed their procedures because it is not, the AOA Disagree light was not a critical safety display. It's advisory only for maintenance recording. It languished, and I am not happy with 13-month gap between finding that anomaly and us finding out about it. And we're going to look into that. We are looking into that, and we will make sure that software anomalies are reported more quickly.
So that was a yes. Did Boeing have an obligation to report this aftermarket software malfunction to existing airline customers for them to be aware of and submit a service difficulty report if necessary? Did Boeing have that responsibility? Yes or no?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I didn't get the beginning.
Yeah, did they have an obligation to report this aftermarket software malfunction to existing airline customers? Is there an obligation on their part to report this malfunction to consumers as well?
So the Boeing ODA and the Boeing software engineers respond to their procedures. I'm going to defer to Earl on whether or not they, that the standards and the ODA manual requires that.
The obligation is to evaluate the anomaly to the internationally approved standards and procedures for looking at that. If those procedures indicate that it's an item that meets a certain level, then yes, it would have to be reported to the other airlines and to the FAA. In this particular case, the approved procedures designated the risk of this item not being in a working condition did not require immediate action. It did require action, and that's what we were talking about. We would like to see quicker reaction than 13 months in the future.
And can you confirm, Mr. Elwell, that Boeing continued to deliver planes with a non-functioning disagree light even after the discovery that it was only operational with add-ons and even after the Lion Air accident?
I believe that the 737 MAX was delivered after the software engineers discovered that anomaly. Yes.
Thank you. And finally, do you believe our current aftermarket reporting requirements are adequate to protect airline passengers?
Ms. Craig, we have an IG report. We have the Blue Ribbon Paneler, the special committee. We have the JATR that we formed. We have this committee's investigation has been initiated, and we're gathering reams and reams of data. All of these reviews are going to look at the process top to bottom and come back with recommendations. I fully expect that when this is all done, we are going to have recommendations that will make us better. In addition, we're going to continue to scrutinize our process. We're going to make sure that it doesn't take 13 months to find out that there's a software anomaly. But I just want to remind everyone here, let's not make the AOA Disagree light the issue. The AOA Disagree light is an advisory. And the AOA Disagree light would not have changed in either accident. I want to make sure everybody understands Don't make something that isn't a critical safety item a critical safety item, because there are enough critical safety items for us to focus on.
Thank you. I yield back.
The chair recognizes Representative Davids, the vice chair of the subcommittee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I, too, would like to extend my condolences to the family members who have lost loved ones and are here today. And I think it's really important for us to recognize that the relationship that exists between this committee and the FAA and the NTSB is one that is clearly geared toward making sure that we are operating the safest airline industry, aerospace industry, and our airways here in this country. And I've been very happy to hear the desire for just an evaluation of where are the things that we can actually address to make sure that no matter what, these types of tragedies don't occur in the future. And, you know, as a member of this committee, I take our constitutional duty of oversight very seriously. And I know that you take the FAA's duty to safety very seriously as well. And because of that, I want to take a step back and ask, how often, and you mentioned in your testimony that the regulations and safety certification procedures are constantly reevaluated. Can you talk a little bit about how often the process is reevaluated to make sure that that when new technologies are coming along and we've got new standards that might be developing, how often are we evaluating the actual process of the certifications?
Thank you for that question. The FAA as an organization is constantly collecting data, evaluating data, taking action, and reviewing. It's the safety management system approach to everything we do. It is never static. Having said that, we don't change just to change. We pull data, we review, we analyze data. We do this both internally and we do it externally. We have what's called, and I don't know how far you want me to go into this, but we have an organization called the Commercial Aviation Safety Team that was formed in 1997. The goal there was to gather data from all stakeholders in the commercial aviation ecosystem and to collect all that data voluntarily and analyze that data, come up with safety enhancements. Since 1997, we've generated over 100 voluntary safety enhancements the entire industry uses, and they use them to this day. And we've reduced the commercial aviation fatality rate by 95% since '97. And that is exactly from what you just asked, from analyzing our processes, gathering data, coming up with solutions, implementing those solutions, and then evaluating the results of that implementation.
And then I'd actually like to hear about the exchange of information between the NTSB and FAA. Earlier, you mentioned that when the NTSB has gone through and looked at probably some of the previous accidents, that at least on one occasion, a recommendation to include video recordings in the cockpit has been made. How often who's making the decision about which recommendations by the NTSB are being adopted into the safety protocols? And can you talk a little bit about what that process looks like?
Is that?
Maybe a little bit about how are the recommendations made, and then how do you decide whether or not you're going to accept those recommendations?
Right, I'll make it quick. The NTSB investigates transportation accidents, and when we find areas that could enhance safety as a result of that accident or crash, we issue safety recommendations. We issue them to the appropriate recipient. We issue for aviation accidents, more than likely they would go to the regulator, who of course is the FAA in this case.
and we receive the NTSB recommendations, and then we have to go through a process to evaluate those recommendations against the whole system. Chairman Sumwalt, we've had this conversation. They have sometimes the enviable luxury of looking at a single event or a single issue. We take every recommendation in its totality for the whole system. And that's why we continue to collaborate and we continue to evaluate all the recommendations to determine whether or not they can be implemented. But the unifying thing between NTSB and FAA is an unshakable desire to improve the system and make the system safer.
Chair recognizes Representative Brownlee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too want to express my condolences to the family who's here today. My daughter lives in Africa and has lived and worked in Africa for the last 5 years. She's lived in a couple of different places. She lived in Nairobi, and my daughter has taken this flight from Addis Ababa many, many times, so this particular crash really hit me hard in my gut, but my condolences to you. I also wanted to follow up on the camera in the cockpit suggestion. So you make the suggestion to the regulator, but none of those suggestions are made public. That doesn't come to Congress.
Thank you for that question. We do not issue recommendations directly to Congress. However, when Congress asks for our input, we do, in fact, provide a list of all open recommendations, and thankfully, oftentimes those recommendations end up getting folded into legislation.
And then when the FAA doesn't agree with recommendations, does that report come to Congress?
Ma'am, I don't think so. I don't think so. But I will check. I'll check and make sure.
Thank you. Mr. Elwell, in your testimony, you talk about, you stated that any party that the FAA regulates remains responsible for compliance with the FAA's regulatory standards, and the FAA does not hesitate to take enforcement action when it is warranted. So was there ever a time through the 737 MAX certification that enforcement was warranted?
The 737 MAX certification began in January 2012 and ended in March 17.
Was there ever, was
5 years.
it ever warranted to
I'll defer
take
to Earl
enforcement?
if we took enforcement action specifically on anything with regard to the MAX.
I do not believe we took any enforcement action regarding the MAX during that 5 years. What would have happened, because it was a certification activity, is anytime we would have gotten any concerns from any of the engineers that were working it, we would have evaluated those and addressed them right then and there before the final certification.
Okay, but there, in terms of some of this self-certification process that's part of the certification process, there was never a need to take any enforcement action?
Not,
yes or no? I've got a lot of questions.
Not for these particular items.
Okay, very good. Also, Mr. Elwell, in your testimony, you say the FAA identifies all safety standards, and makes all key decisions regarding certification of the aircraft. So, from your perspective, does that ultimately mean that the buck stops with you?
Yes, ma'am, it does.
Thank you. Also, in your testimony, you talked about the process for certification included 297 certification flight tests, and you say then some of which encompass tests of the MCAS functions. Can you tell me how many times that was tested? You gave the number for the overall process, but not for the MCAS.
Yes, 297 flights, 133 we flew, and the others we contributed in some way or another. I don't know the number of test flights where the MCAS was
Do you
evaluated.
have that in a record somewhere?
We certainly would have that and get that back to you, yes, ma'am.
Okay, very good. You also went on in your testimony to talk about Secretary Chow and the U.S. Department's Inspector General report. Do you have any idea when that report will be available to the public?
I think you're referring to the IG report she
Yes.
directed on certification. I don't want to set a date for the IG, but generally, those investigations take 9 to 18 months.
Thank you. Secretary Chow also announced the establishment of a special committee to review the FAA's procedures for certification. You stated that that will be presented directly to the Secretary and the FAA Administrator. What about to the public and to Congress?
Ma'am, typically, the special committee that will be formed under the SOCAC, it is, for lack of a better term, a blue ribbon panel. And in my experience over my career, blue ribbon panel results are often made public. But I won't speak for the Secretary as to how those results will be disseminated. But I can, again, get that answer for you, absolutely.
Thank you. I have more questions, but my time is up, and I yield back.
Chair recognizes Representative Allred for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our panelists for being here. I represent Dallas, which is home to Southwest Airlines and American Airlines, two of our best airlines here in the country who've also invested heavily in the 737 MAX. We also have Boeing in our area, and I recognize the investment that they've made in this and the price that it's costing our airlines, the grounding of the MAX, and I also, of course, recognize what this is doing to Boeing. But I think that our role on this committee, and your role, obviously, as I know you agree at the FAA, is that our motivation for being here is that we want to make sure that our airspace is the safest in the world, that we continue to be the gold standard. I've been asked a lot about the MAX in Dallas, and then I always say that we still are the gold standard for safety, and that we will remain that. And so my questioning in these next couple of minutes is getting at making sure we maintain that. Because when we spoke back in March, when you briefed us in a private briefing, I mentioned to you reports from pilots with concerns that were being raised about the MAX, and you kind of downplayed some of those. And as the Dallas Morning News recently reported, and as some of my colleagues have mentioned, a recording between the American Airlines Pilot Union and Boeing on November 27th, 2018, the pilots expressed a number of concerns to the Boeing executives. And my question to you is, was the FAA made aware by Boeing or by anyone else about that meeting or about any of the pilots' concerns?
Well, thank you for that question, Mr. Allred. My first indication of that meeting was when I read about it in the article. And obviously I can't speak to a private meeting. I will tell you this, though. My understanding is that meeting happened not long after the Lion Air accident. And I will tell you, as a lifelong pilot, that when an accident happens anywhere, and it includes an airplane you fly, it becomes visceral. It's an emotional response, pilots who fly an airplane when they see one go down. And I would imagine that there was heightened emotions in that meeting. I will tell you that when I was briefed and they explained the Lion Air and the data we gathered and told me about the MCAS, and I learned that it wasn't explained in the manual, my pilot juices started flowing, and I said, well, we need to look into that. So I don't discount what was reported in that meeting, and I understand it. But I can't comment on it, what was said in the meeting.
Okay, do you know if there were any ODA designees present at that meeting for Boeing?
I have no idea.
Okay, if not, should there be a requirement placed on manufacturers like Boeing to disclose the concerns of pilots when they're presented in a fashion like that? Should the FAA have been made aware of that?
Sir, my initial reaction to that question would be anytime a manufacturer that the FAA has regulatory oversight over becomes aware of a critical safety item, it should be made known. to the FAA. And I'll defer to Earl if that's actually part of a regulatory
It is
requirement.
actually a regulatory requirement that if they become aware of anything that's critical to safety, they need to disclose that to us.
So after one crash, when a major American airline, major pilot union is expressing their concerns, that should have been raised to the FAA.
Again, if it is a critical safety of flight item, either
I would
procedural-
say, I'm not a pilot. I would say, though, if we've had a crash and our professional pilots here domestically are expressing their concerns, that's something that the FAA should know about. And so I think that that's something we need to look at here in Congress to make sure that you have that information as quickly as possible.
If I could add, Mr. Allred, at around that same time, since the Lion Air accident and forward to today, my communications, I happen to have been a Allied Pilot Association member for 16 years. I had regular conversations with the leadership of the Southwest Airline Pilot Association, the Allied Pilot Association, and the Airline Pilot Association on a regular basis, because we thrive on transparency, we thrive on communication. And I had regular conversations with them, including an April 12th meeting where we brought in the unions of all three of our U.S. operators of the MAX and their flight departments. And we had a give and take for about 2.5 hours.
Well, thank you. And just, Mr. Chairman, for the record, if we could, I'd like to have an answer on the MCAS not being in the manual and how the decision was reached by the FAA not to require that. If you could submit that for the record, I'd appreciate that.
Yes, sir.
For the record. So we'll proceed with the second round of questioning, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes and go to Mr. Sumwalt and Ms. Schultz with regards to the ET-302 report as an example of how we work in a supporting manner as opposed to lead. Are there things in the ET-302 report that you would characterize differently if you were writing it?
Well, I'll take a stab at that and then let Dana mention it. The Ethiopian government has not had the number of investigations that we've had. And I say that not in a bragging manner, but we've been in business for a long time. They have not had many major accidents in Ethiopia. So they don't have the level of experience that we do. Again, I'm not bragging nor making a condescending statement. It's just a fact. As a result of that, they are moving very cautiously and very deliberately. And so as far as the rest of that, I'll defer to Dana.
Thank you for the question, Chairman Larson. And in fact, we're very pleased that the Ethiopian government did release a report publicly. That information was critically important, of course, to the FAA and Boeing, but it was also critically important to other airlines flying the aircraft and frankly, other regulators worldwide to understand all the factors. With that said, as we see in many preliminary reports issued by different countries, they're perhaps not exactly as the NTSB would format the information or produce it, but I would say that the preliminary report is just that. It's the information that was available at the time. And so I would caution that that's not everything by any stretch, and some of that information will need to be expanded further. And we are, of course, working very closely with the Ethiopian government to make sure that we contribute and participate in that work.
Does ICAO provide a rubric or a standard format for the reporting, for developing actually, and for actually reporting the results of the investigation?
Yes, the short answer to that is yes. ICAO Annex 13 outlines the standards and recommended practices.
Yes, okay. And to your satisfaction, in the case of ET-302, the Ethiopian government is following those standards and practices?
They are, but Dana was just in Ethiopia last week, and I think she could further elaborate.
Yes, they are following the Annex 13 practice, and we as a state, our state of manufacture, have our accredited representative as part of the investigation along with our advisors. And so I was in Addis to meet with the investigative agency to reinforce the U.S. support and our participation in the follow-on investigation at this point that will go forward. So yes, they are following the process, and we are going to continue to work closely with them on that in all areas.
So in the case of the Lion Air and Ethiopia, well, I guess when we apply our standard of timelines, we tend to think it takes a year to get a final report out from NTSB, about, give or take. Do you anticipate it'll be a year for the Lion Air report and a year from the crash for the ET-302 report?
Yes, in the case of Lion Air, they have said that they would, they're planning to get the report out by the 12-month anniversary. As far as Ethiopian?
It's very early in the stage for Ethiopian. We couldn't say, but the Indonesian government is planning to have a report released towards the fall.
Thanks. Administrator Elwell, regarding next week's meeting in, is it next week in Dallas with the Directors General, what is the FAA's goal in this meeting?
Thank you for that question, sir. The goal is to offer all of these countries who have grounded or prohibited flight in their airspace, 737 MAX, the benefit of all the information and all the thinking we, as the state of design, have to offer them. It has been mentioned several times in this hearing that there is the perception, at least, of a crisis in confidence, particularly with regard to the airplane, and maybe larger. It is my hope that we get to, in a way, sort of fix the process that didn't, in my opinion, go in a way that we're used to internationally on the initial, at the accident. Internationally, we are collaborative 99% of the time. When the Ethiopian accident happened, it was not a collaborative process from Sunday night to Wednesday morning, despite our best efforts and attempts to have conversations. I know countries act, and they act for various reasons. This, on the ungrounding, I think it's just critically important that as a global aviation community, we do what we do best. We collaborate, we exhibit transparency, we answer the questions that I'm sure these countries are going to have of us, and then at the end of the day, and it will be literally a day-long agenda and regimen with them, my hope is that they have the confidence in our work, in our analysis, to make their ungrounding decisions, if that's where the discussion is, as close to our decision as possible, because I think that's important for the world to have some level of confidence.
Thank you. I did notice two members came in after we started the second round. In fairness, though, I did promise the ranking side a set of questions unless they want to be kind enough to let us go to the members who came in for a first round. I'm just trying to figure out what the rules are. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So, all right. We'll recognize Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just in answer to an earlier question, I did change the law a number of years ago, and I think Mr. Zumwalt is aware of this. You do have to respond when they submit things to you. You can say yay or nay, but you do have to meaningfully respond. It used to be that you'd send things over and they would never respond and ignore them. So you should be getting yays or nays out of the FAA when you send things over.
Mr. Chairman, you're right, and I didn't realize that was the question, but absolutely, we are required to tell them that we're doing it or not doing it or why.
It used to be that they went into the ether. Now they have to at least tell you that they don't agree. In any case, just to clarify that. So to Mr. Lawrence, as my understanding is originally the Europeans and the Brazilians said retraining of pilots was required. Later, for whatever reason, the Europeans decided it wasn't. Is that correct?
That's not my understanding of it.
Okay, what about the Brazilians?
Again, there was lots of discussions, and my understanding is...
So that list of 40 or 60 things, can't remember the exact number, that the Brazilians had about the plane that they thought were significant differences doesn't exist?
I actually have an email here, sir, from the Brazilians that recalled that and said that was a mistake.
It was a mistake to say all those things that would require retraining, and so then they just withdrew it.
I think the context of all of these things is these are discussions when we evaluate aircraft, and they
Right.
met everything in that discussion.
All right, fine, but that's something that we're going to be looking into, and I've asked for both the Brazilians and the Europeans to respond, because there's questions on why they changed their mind, or when they changed their mind, or how they changed their mind in this process. Now, to the administrator, so it's an amended type certificate because there's an artificial system, the MCAS, which makes it fly like the earlier versions, the NG and others. Now, if we have essentially neutered the MCAS, all you have to do is pull on the yoke, does it now fly the same as all the earlier planes? And so it's still an amended type, or is it now a new type?
So, Mr. Chairman, actually, in the MAX, pulling back the yoke doesn't.
It will in the future, my understanding. The fix?
No, the fix won't include the yoke pullback cutout.
Okay, all right,
Because
that was
disables,
reported,
yeah.
and the staff was under that impression. Okay. So, but, all right, so MCAS is going to be modified to work off both sensors. That's the only major change, except it will only trigger once.
Correct, and there's one more. And I can, and the engineers can imagine a scenario where this would happen, but in the Lion Air and Ethiopian incidents, the MCAS kept re-engaging because it still was receiving the signal that it needed to engage until it reached a point with the motion of the stabilizer. This is the stabilizer in the back of the airplane. That pilots always have to do that, but it reached a point where they did not have yoke authority to reverse the dive. The third part of the fix is no matter if it re-engages more than once, and it would have to completely reset and go back to the proper, it will always give the pilots 1.5 Gs of authority. It will always give, it will never go to full deflection. So even in the chance that it powers several times, the pilots will have yoke authority.
Okay, just also for an earlier point you made about us leading the world and ICAO on training standards, I would point out that Congress had to mandate that change after Colgan Air because I had been trying for many years and we hadn't gotten there. And so that was something that wasn't initiated, and this was before your time by FAA. It was something that was mandated by the Congress. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you. After consulting the committee rules, members get a first round, and so we'll start with Mr. Carbajal from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Administrator Elwell, in the last several years, FAA has moved to utilization of ODA authority to speed up the certification process. How does the agency determine whether or not it has enough inspectors or engineers to provide adequate oversight?
Thank you for that question, sir. I would make a slight correction. The Organizational Designation Authority, ODA, that you referenced, actually wasn't put in place to speed up certification. It was put in place so that a robust certification process could happen with collaboration between the FAA and the manufacturer of design. And the detail about that is really in the wheelhouse of Mr. Lawrence as the head of certification.
So I believe your question was about our oversight and how do we maintain that in the ratio. There's multiple programs depending on the type of oversight, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's oversight of an air carrier, or whether it's over the design. And we evaluate that on an annual basis to make sure that we have sufficient resources to oversee those particular items, and they're done individually, and they are influenced by other factors such as a company's financial status, whether there's pilots on strike, and we take all the external items, not just their performance, in consideration about what resources we have on their oversight.
That sounds very vague to me. There's no standards that dictate the number of engineers or inspectors that you need to have on site?
The standards don't articulate a ratio when it comes to ODA of a specific number of our resources to a specific number of their resources. What the standards dictate is that we have the individuals necessary to do the oversight. The reason why it's not a single one-size-fits-all is because of the different types of ODAs and the way they're structured. When it comes to Boeing, it is such a big one and it is so critical to us. We established a specific Boeing oversight office that is their sole job, to provide that day in and day out so that their attention is not split in between oversight of another ODA or another manufacturer. They are focused solely on making sure that the ODA and Boeing's performance meet our expectations.
Thank you. In October 2015, the Department of Transportation Office of Inspector General recommended that FAA adopt a new oversight approach for ODA holders by developing new evaluation criteria and risk-based tools. The Inspector General recently testified that this report recommendation is still open. What is the status of this effort, and why has it taken so long to do so?
Sir, thanks for that question. We, the FAA, welcome the evaluation, the audit, the review that the IG offers, that this committee offers. Every time somebody does any entity within the FAA or externally, we learn something new and we get better. It's how we've reached the level of safety that we have today. And the recommendation you referred to, the 2015 recommendation about ODA oversight, I'm going to let Earl answer the specifics of that, but what it has taken us is from a sort of a strict adherence to an annual review to something that is more akin to the way we do our oversight and the way we do our regulation in the system today, which is much more data-driven, risk-based, performance-based, so that we have the freedom to go and inspect an ODA 5 times in a year if we need to, if the data suggests, but I'll let Earl explain the specifics.
Well, I'll just add, in the interest of time, that we accepted every single one of those recommendations. We've implemented them all except for one, and it's not because we don't accept it. It's just it takes a period of time to implement fully all those recommendations, so we accept them all, and we're grateful for those, and they are guiding us going forward.
So how much longer is it going to take to implement this one?
So the last one is tied into implementation of direction from this committee as well, to change the way we provide oversight, to have a dedicated organizational delegation office. That was designated by Mr. Elwell in April. And so that has started, and it will take us at least the summer to restructure and get everything in place to implement that. So I'm hoping by the end of this calendar year, we will have completed that final recommendation as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Representative Garcia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement written by the parents of Samia Rose Stumo, who was just 24 years old when she was killed in the March 10th crash of a Boeing Max8 airplane while on a mission to help others with health care in low and middle income countries. Her parents, as all of you know, Nadia Millerson and her father, Michael Stumo, are tirelessly advocating for greater airline safety, and of course they have joined us during the duration of the hearing today.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll waive my statement to ask questions as the hour is late as it pertains to this hearing. Mr. Elwell, would you please confirm that proper operation of MCAS was considered a critical or essential safety feature in your certification of Boeing 737 MAX aircraft?
Yes, sir. The MCAS was certified as a critical safety product in the total certification of the aircraft.
Would the plane have been certified without it?
That's too subjective for me to answer. I can't give you an answer for the record on that.
Mr. Lawrence, sir?
I can maybe add a little context to it. The MCAS system was installed to make sure that it was in compliance with a specific regulation and handling characteristics. So that was the method Boeing chose to meet that requirement. They would have to meet that requirement. If they didn't do it through MCAS, they would have had to meet that requirement through some other means, which could have been a structural change.
Okay. What review functions were delegated to Boeing's engineers and Boeing engineer managers serving as outside evaluators? Mr. Elwell, or either one of you.
Sir, could you repeat the beginning of that question?
What review functions were delegated to Boeing engineers and Boeing engineers/managers serving as outside evaluators?
So I'm going to defer to Earl on the specifics of that question.
So I believe, sir, you're referring to the organizational delegation members who are employees of Boeing and their oversight.
That's correct.
And I make the distinction because Boeing, the company, not the ODA, is responsible for compliance and must show all the compliance finding. The members of the ODA and that structure, which all members are approved and vetted by the FAA, are the reviewers of whatever Boeing, the company, does first before we have our third set of eyes on the work that they do. Am I answering your question, sir?
I think so. Let me change gears as the clock is ticking. In light of the apparent malfunctions of the MCAs in these crashes, have you considered the adequacy of your review of the MCAs and any other essential critical safety equipment on the 737 MAX or other airplanes?
Mr. Garcia, thank you for that question, sir. That is exactly what we're doing. It's what the IG is going to look at as directed by the Secretary, the processes by which we certify aircraft. The Joint Authority Tech Review is going to look at the flight control computer system and the certification thereof. And of course, the special committee or the blue ribbon panel that is been also commissioned by the Secretary is going to look at the process that we used for certifying the MCAS 737 MAX and our certification processes writ large. Again, these are reviews and audits and investigations that, because they have been helpful in making us better, we welcome them, and we will participate to the extent that we're able and look forward to the recommendations.
Thank you. And to Chairman Sumwalt, do you think that the outcome of the investigations that are ongoing will result in greater training of pilots from other countries?
Congressman Garcia, that's hard to say. We need to figure out everything involved in each of these actions to actually make that determination. Of course, as you know, ultimately the determination on training will be up to the regulator.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Representative Brown for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier in the hearing, Chairman DeFazio was asking about who engineers report to. Engineers reporting to managers. A point was made that often these managers are engineers. For me, what that raises is really just the fundamental question of the independence of the engineers who are making these decisions, these assessments, evaluations about compliance, whether it's design or build out of these components to an aircraft. The investigation around the Challenger shuttle explosion in 1986 found instances where engineers and employees raised concerns about the shuttle that were not efficiently taken into consideration by management. And I know, obviously NASA and FAA are different and the processes are different. But my concern is that this could be another example of a management failure and not necessarily or exclusively an engineering failure. Sometimes managers are influenced by
factors other than safety and quality, and that's the nature of large organizations. Maybe it's profit, maybe it's public pressure to deliver something. So I'd like to ask about the mechanisms that are in place at the management level to ensure that engineering, software, and labor concerns are adequately taken into account when evaluating new and old products. The FAA is responsible for ensuring that as products are brought to market, all reasonable efforts have been made to properly characterize risk and ensure public safety is fully protected. At the core of this function is the independence of engineers who are conducting the evaluation. So, Mr. Elwell, what processes does the FAA have in place to maintain the independence of its engineering assessments for certifying flight worthiness and ensuring that there's an environment that engineers understand that their professional engineering opinion will be valued and supported?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Brown. That is exactly what we have endeavored to instill in the ODA process from its inception. And that is a freedom of the ODA members to come to the FAA with any and all. In fact, it's trained. Every ODA member is vetted by the FAA before that member is approved. Things such as integrity, professionalism, experience in certification, all of those things are weighed. I would point out, not only has ODA been a refined process for decades, it's also been endorsed by Congress in a number of FAA reauthorizations that have actually expanded in statute our responsibilities to increase ODA. And I say that only to point out that ODA, when done right, is indispensable to the safety of the system and to the health and growth of our aviation ecosystem. Having said that, the investigations that have been initiated as a result of these accidents, we're going to follow with great interest, and we're going to take the recommendations and the findings to make the system better.
Let me ask this follow-up, and I appreciate that. In the course of evaluating the safety of the 737 MAX during the certification, were there any dissenting opinions raised during the evaluation of its flight worthiness? And is the process set up where an engineer may disagree with another and raise that independently to the FAA?
Is your question, did that happen?
Yeah,
or
did it
is
happen?
that something
Yeah, did
that
it happen and does that happen?
I don't know if we have record of that, and Earl could address that, but I would.
Earl, can you address that?
We do not have a specific record of for example, a written complaint from one of the Boeing engineers or a concern, but I want to reinforce that there's dialogue in between FAA engineers and Boeing engineers along the whole process, and they do express concerns. They do have technical debates, and that is a normal part of the process, and I want to highlight that the FAA sets the standards, and the FAA is the final decision maker. And we do that to protect the engineers, as you are articulating, that they can't change the standards. They evaluate whether they're making those, meeting those standards. And when they see undue pressure, we actually require the Boeing ODA to have a whole reporting system, which they have a process to evaluate any of those concerns and report it back up.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Continuing with first round questions, Mr. Lynch, Representative Lynch is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and I want to thank the witnesses for your help. Mr. Lawrence, the issue around the sensors and the fact that at least it is alleged in some of the press reports that that the purchasing airlines were not aware that certain sensors were inactive. Have you dealt with that in terms of your own investigation and your own review of what has happened in both of these airline accidents?
So, sir, I believe you're referring to the angle of attack annunciator or indicator in the cockpit.
Right.
That was discovered by Boeing. It was not reported to the airlines upon their discovery. It was evaluated as an item under our software standards that did not have to be reported because there wasn't a associated pilot action with that indicator. So since there was not an associated pilot action to take based on that, it was really there for a maintenance alert, then they were not required, they were required to update it and bring it back into working condition, but they were not required to report it at that time.
So going back to the bifurcation between the FAA's responsibility versus the responsibilities that we designate back to the manufacturer, is that something that that if it were a core FAA function would have been made aware, would have been, that information would have been made aware to the airlines themselves? Or is that something that would have gone undiscovered regardless?
Sir, if there had been to your question, if it had been a critical safety of flight item, it would have been immediately reported and would have been required to be immediately reported. It took too long. We don't need the IG investigation, the JATR, or the special committee to tell us that 13 months was too long for us to find out that there was a software anomaly. And you have our commitment that we're going to look into that and fix that.
Okay. As I read the organizational designation authorization, this is the program where FAA hands off responsibilities to Boeing. There's definitely, in my mind, an asymmetry in technological ability that Boeing has here, and I'm worried about regulatory capture, if you will. Under the ODA, it says that only non-critical matters will be shifted to Boeing. And when I hear the full committee chairman say that this is a single point of failure, in retrospect, do you agree that you know, the designation to Boeing for this responsibility should have been kept with the FAA?
Thanks for that question, Mr. Lynch. We are going to wait for the investigations on process for an analysis of there's 3 different studies right now engaged on the 737 MAX certification. In general, in ODAs, we delegate to the manufacturer non-critical items so that we can focus on the safety critical or new and novel aspects of the certification of the aircraft.
Okay, let me reclaim my time. I understand that, and I fully respect that. Let me just go back, and I know other members have said this already, but this is a devastating pair of accidents here, and my heart and my prayers go out to all the victims and their families. You also realize that this cannot happen again, right? This cannot happen again. If we lose another aircraft, and I'm in the city of Boston, and so planes taking off from Logan, under these circumstances, 40 seconds out, minute and 40 seconds out, would land in very densely settled neighborhoods and would be totally devastating. So we have to get this right, and I trust you'll do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Lynch. We'll go to continue second rounds now and start with Representative Balderson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My first question is to both witnesses, and it's on behalf of Ranking Member Graves. His question was, how do U.S. airline operations and safety programs differ from non-U.S. airlines?
Now, sir, each state is responsible for its own safety programs. We have a set of standards set in guidance, really, but adhered to internationally. We have 100, as Chairman Sumwalt said earlier, we have 193 nations participate in the International Civil Aviation Organization, a UN body, who adhere to those standards, aviation standards, across all aspects of the aviation ecosystem. Those minimums must be met or exceeded for any country to have fly to our country or to have a code-share relationship with one of our carriers to fly to our country. But it is up to each country to determine whether or not they're going to adhere to the minimums or raise them. In the U.S., clearly, our standards in almost every category far exceed ICAO standards. That's not to say that the ICAO standards in any area are necessarily too low, but we wouldn't have the safety record that we have in our country if we hadn't raised the bar. And the important thing here, sir, is that we don't just raise the bar in our own little silo here in U.S. aviation. We have been proactive internationally for decades. And as Chairman DeFazio mentioned, one of the things that this committee, that he championed, which is upset training and stall training, that was added to the training for our pilots, in large part as a result of the Colgan incident. We went to ICAO and we made the case, and it was accepted at ICAO that that additional training should be an international standard. And we're now in the process of ensuring that that's implemented globally.
Congressman, the NTSB has nothing to add to what Acting Administrator Elwell said.
Thank you very much. My next question is to Mr. Elwell. There have been numerous reports in the media that the certification of the MAX was rushed. How long did the certification of the MAX take?
Sir, the certification of the MAX began with the application in January 2012, and it ended and was certificated by former FAA Administrator Michael Huerta in March of 2017. The whole process took 5 years, just around 5 years. The average for an amended type certificate, somewhere between 3 and 5. So I certainly wouldn't characterize it as rushed. We adhere to the principle that a certification is done when all of the standards and the regulations are complied with, not a day before or day after. And that's the criteria we use for the MAX.
Okay, thank you. One follow-up. Do you know the typical amount of time a European Union aviation safety agency certification takes?
Sir, I personally don't, but Earl, do they have an average?
I don't know what their average is, but our on average projects that we've been involved on with some of theirs has been 3 years.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my remaining time.
All right. The chair recognizes the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee, Representative Davids from Kansas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I wanted to get into a little bit more about the distinction between the light, the sensor will set off the, I don't remember what the differentiating.
The Aoa Disagree light?
Disagree light. So the disagree light is something separate and apart from the MCAS system or the augmentation system actually engaging, right? So the light has been the focus of and maybe it's the canary in the coal mine, I don't know, but I think the bigger issue is if the system engages and pilots have to respond to it or are forced to respond to it, the training and the notice that might be the case seems where there's a little bit of a disconnect or a concern of many members on the committee. So what prompted the Emergency Airworthiness Directive that was issued in November 2018? I know the Lion Air tragedy happened, and then after that, the Emergency Airworthiness Directive was issued. And it specifically called for operators of the 737 MAX to revise their flight manuals to reinforce and emphasize to flight crews how to recognize and respond to uncommanded stabilizer trim movement and MCAS events. What prompted that directive?
So thank you for that question. Soon after the accident, it was apparent, the Lion Air accident, it was apparent that it was an MCAS event. And it's important to note that the MCAS is designed so that if it engages when it is supposed to, in other words, in certain angles of attack, which means nose high to the airstream, and under certain conditions, if it were to function, it's designed such that the pilots would not even know that it's operating. So by definition, if it operates when it's not supposed to, which is what happened in both of these cases, pilots would immediately know that something, maybe not the MCAS, and this is why it's very important. An analogy I think that makes sense in this regard is if someone in a restaurant is choking, you don't find out what they're choking on before you administer the Heimlich. It's exactly the same in runaway pitch trim. When a pilot feels the nose going over in his hands, he'll feel it in the yoke. He's trained from the beginning, at least U.S. pilots, and it's not to say that international or not. That's runaway pitch trim. And when the MCAS kicked in when it wasn't supposed to, it drove the nose over. In the pilot's hands, they could feel it. So when we looked at that data and realized by the flight data recorder showed that the runaway pitch trim procedure was not done with Lion Air in the entirety of the flight, we knew that this needs to be emphasized. And that's what the emergency AD did. It said, remember, if you get a pitch over activity in an airplane and you didn't tell the airplane to do it, that's runaway pitch trim. Run the runaway pitch trim procedure. That's why we put in an emergency AD. We also added, and this was important, that before you run that procedure, before you physically turn off those stab trim motors, you still are able to use the trim switch on the yoke. Trim the pressure off the yoke so that instead of feeling it pushing you over and pulling it back and fighting it, trim off that pressure so the yoke is in a neutral state. Very important to do that before turning off those motors. That was also in those instructions. And that became critically important with the Ethiopian accident.
So what is the process to follow up on an emergency airworthiness directive to ensure that the flight manuals and the reinforcement of the process that's supposed to be followed? How do you make sure that once you've sent out the directive that it is actually being adhered to?
I'm going to ask Earl to watch me on this answer, but when we, the FAA, issue an emergency AD and it applies to an aircraft that has worldwide use, it is married up with a manufacturer's directive, which in this case Boeing put out. And it's also, we do what's called a continuous airworthiness notice to international community. A CANIC is also distributed globally, pointing to the emergency AD. Once we do that, then it is incumbent upon every civil aviation authority that is a state of registry for that aircraft, that oversees their airlines, their training, to make sure that that manufacturer's bulletin and the FAA AD are adhered to.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I have a few questions for wrap up. First for Chair Sumwalt. How would you characterize the ongoing communications now between NTSB and the Indonesian investigators and Ethiopian investigators?
Very good, and of course Dana was in Ethiopia last week to ensure that we maintain those good relationships.
Same with Indonesia?
Indonesia is very good as well.
All right, great. Mr. Elwell, we talked about the TAB, the Technical Advisory Board. Is it your intent that the FAA would not make a decision to unground the 737 MAX unless TAB recommendations were implemented?
Mr. Chairman, it is my intent to have any TAB recommendation dealt with and adjudicated. Ultimately, the decision to unground rests on me, rests on the FAA. I'm sole responsibility for it, so I'm not going to sit here today and put some responsibility on the TAB that I shouldn't. But the whole reason that we created the TAB and that they're working with us and looking at the process right now is so that we can benefit from their expertise.
Okay. So before we wrap, I want to give both of the witnesses a chance to add anything that they'd like to, and I'd start with Chair Sumwalt.
Well, thank you. I think we've heard questions about pilot training, and maybe that there may be different standards throughout the world. And I think it's important to point out that if an aircraft manufacturer is going to sell airplanes all across the globe, then it's important that pilots who are operating those airplanes in those parts of the globe know how to operate them. And I think that's important. Just to say that the U.S. standards are very good, and this might be a problem with other parts of the globe, I don't think that's part of the answer. And I don't mean this, I hate to use this term, but the airplane has to be trained to the lowest common denominator. Thank you.
Administrator Elwell.
Mr. Chairman, first I want to say again how sincerely aggrieved we all are the loss of lives in both of these accidents. It's the reason why we do what we do, is to prevent that. So when it happens, it's horrific and it drives us. And if I could leave this committee and the American public with anything, it is that the 45,000 professionals at the FAA and Secretary Chow and this committee, we are all united in the goal to make sure that we look at everything possible. And that's why all of these investigations, these audits, these reviews are so critically important, because we're going to learn from them and we're going to honor the people who passed in these accidents. And we're going to make it better.
Thank you. No further questions from the subcommittee. Seeing none, I want to thank each of our witnesses today for your testimony. The contribution to today's discussion has been informative and very helpful. I'd ask unanimous consent the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that will be submitted to them in writing, and unanimous consent in the record that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, that is so ordered. And if no other members have anything to add, the subcommittee stands adjourned.
Dana?
Can you just clarify one thing you just said, which is that you won't necessarily adopt all of the recommendations of the tab? Can't you just give us an answer on that?
You guys have to stop at the door, so.
Okay, who's up?
You said this was
I think he started.
No, go ahead.
Okay, go ahead.
Sorry. Jillian Rich with Investors Business Daily. You said this was the first of several hearings. When can we expect Boeing or some pilots to be up here to speak?
We will have subsequent hearings. I really want to have documents from Boeing before I call them as a witness.
When might you expect those documents?
I think that we're looking at next month for the next hearing. Probably more of a focus on hearing from consumers and perhaps the pilots. But I agree with Pete. I don't know that it does us a lot of good right now, today, to have Boeing to come tell us they can't answer any of our questions. Having the documents from Boeing, having documents from the FAA, will give us a better pathway to develop the questions that we can get answers to in the hearings.
What reasons have they given for not providing documents? Any documents?
Well, I don't know where Doug is, but I think it's been, they've raised issues about how we're going to cover proprietary information, which is legitimate, but I think we should have or should be able to work that out. The investigative staff isn't right here, so I don't know whether she'll go get him.
I agree with you. I haven't heard anything, any resistance but for the issue of proprietary information. That doesn't mean there's anything else. That's the only issue I've heard of it. So that just becomes a matter of negotiating, proper handling of the documents from on our end.
So is your anticipation that can be resolved outside of a subpoena, or is that something?
Well, I said what I said, which is I would hope that we will have voluntary compliance. We are capable of protecting proprietary data. I've been involved in issues like that previously. I served on Homeland Security for many years. I know how to handle intel, so we could do that. They're just wondering about the discussions about proprietary data with Boeing.
So with both Boeing and FAA, we've had ongoing discussions with them, and we're hoping that this breaks free very soon and that we start to get records in, but they've still been pulling material, but we don't have anything yet.
Have you gotten anything from the FAA?
I thought we had that.
We've gotten lists to help us narrow our search.
So you haven't gotten any documents from
one
the FAA?
document which happens to be public. So we don't have a lot from them, but they've
Secretary
started.
Chow assured me they would be cooperative,
Yes.
so I expect they're going to be cooperative. And narrowing, I worked, and as did the chairman, on our requests, because our initial requests were fairly global, and we tried to narrow them down, and unless they're trying to have us omit something critical from our requests, I'm happy to have them help us channel our requests so we get the meaningful information we want and not just a pile of stuff this high. And you can say he put his hand 4 feet off the ground.
Have you been able to interview any FAA officials as part of your ongoing investigation?
We haven't asked for any yet. Again, that's a key part of the decision-making process that was the subject today. So, we have not made any specific requests.
Not yet.
Okay.
Do you think, based on the timeline of the various reviews the FAA has going on, that they're going to move ahead with a decision on whether to unground before either the TAB or the JTAR or these other reviews?
I thought they said today for sure they wouldn't act before the TAB. Didn't they say that?
Yeah, that's what I heard. That the Technical
that's what I
Advisory
heard.
Board would be giving them recommendations and information to inform the decision about ungrounding. That's why it exists. They did put it. The FAA created it in response to the letter that we wrote, so the JATR is something different, more about the broader certification process. But there's a process in place to unground this airplane. The FAA, because we told them to, created an additional step to help make that decision through the TAB.
At the tail end of this, Elwell said that, he declined to say categorically that he would accept every single recommendation that the TAB made. Did that strike you as consequential, or was that expected?
It makes sense to me that the administrator said that the final decision rests with the administrator first, because it does. They can't delegate that. They have no authority to delegate that decision. We haven't given them any delegation authority for that decision. That is, Congress hasn't. But I also heard that they will be taking the TAB recommendations. My guess is that it'll be a typical process where the TAB will have to both provide the recommendation and explain the recommendation. The FAA may say, well, this is why that particular way won't work, but let's negotiate how to make this work. But without stepping into the middle of it, right now, I don't know I can give you much more. I do, though, believe that we ought to ourselves have transparency into what the TAB is recommending to the FAA.
Is it not clear that that'll be publicly disclosed at this point?
It's not clear to me, but it's not.
We didn't create the entity. We asked for the entity. I'm not certain how, but I would hope that their recommendations would be certainly available to the committee and I think available publicly. We have to take every step possible to restore confidence if this plane is going to fly again.
But here's the thing, like you recommended the TAB, and he must have used that as an answer 15 or 20 times as a process by which we should, that should restore confidence, right? So what are you calling for specifically in terms of the release and adherence to it? Have you set up, are you going to make any demands based on, either for transparency?
Until we see the report, I can't tell you. I mean, it's speculative. We asked them to create a separate entity outside of their organization that would act independently. They've done that, so I think that's a good first step. The next step will be when they make recommendations, which I will want to see myself.
And this gets to the fundamental issue about FAA having a credibility problem, which we want to help them address. But if they didn't have a problem with certification, they wouldn't have had to create a Blue Ribbon Commission or the JATR or have a TAB. The fact that they are doing these things is a reflection of the fact that even the FAA recognizes that there is public confidence is a bit shaken.
But he didn't say that there was any problem with the RDA process. He defended it. Did it disturb you that he didn't at least admit that there might be some need for fundamental reform of that process?
I think what I heard him say is that they're looking at the Blue Ribbon Commission and the JATR to help define that decision. That's also one of the targets of the committee's investigation.
You and other members spend a lot of time talking about what's critical safety system, whether MCAS is a critical safety system. The FAA has been all over the map in terms of when they consider it critical, when they didn't consider it critical. Does that concern you? I mean, what do you make of that?
I heard a very definitive answer to my question today that it was safety critical.
Right.
So that raises a whole questions about the process it went through, the level of scrutiny and review it got, because it's a safety critical system. So that, again, will be part of our investigation. Okay?
Thank you. Great.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
I like your tie.
Oh, yeah, it's actually, it looks like planes.
It's like a bird.
Up here, well, they kind of turn into flying fish.
Yeah,
Well, see, there's a plane.
See some of them? I was confused.
Nick Callio has the same type of...
We have the same haircut.